Hello, Helena. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, Clara. Yes, I'm a creative non-fiction writer, and my books have almost always got some connection with Italy, the culture and the social history of Italy. And that really, I suppose that stems from having done an Italian degree years and years ago. That's how it all started.
But what does Italy look like to someone coming from the north of Europe?
Well, I can only really describe what it looked like to me, aged 18, getting on a train, getting on a ferry on the south coast of England, and then finding a train on the other side of the channel and going to Paris, and then changing trains and getting onto one of those wonderful, what was it called? The Paletino, was it, that used to go to Florence? And it was an overnight train, and you woke up in the morning and looked out of the window and you were somewhere around Genoa, I imagine. And there outside the train were orange trees. I remember that very vividly and thinking how exotic, how romantic, what a place, with citrus trees with the sea behind them. And so I think that's what Northern Europeans have always felt and always do feel coming to Italy, coming to the Mediterranean for the first time.
But you were first fascinated by gardens. How did you come to lemons?
Well, I really by luck, one of those things that used to happen at the end of the 80s, I got commissioned to write a book about Italian gardens. Um, with no qualifications beyond speaking Italian. And I was commissioned with my husband, a photographer, and it was a very bad timing because we had a tiny baby. But we were up for it. We set off with a baby in a tent, and we spent most of her first year looking at Italian gardens and especially Renaissance and Baroque gardens. What fascinated me was not really the plants so much, but what used to happen in those gardens. And one of the things I noticed even back then was these huge pots with citrus trees growing in them. And I suppose I became fascinated by them because when I looked at them more closely, I realized that they didn't just have oranges and lemons growing on them. They had sometimes oranges and lemons on the same tree in the same pot. Sometimes they had fruit that was striped. Sometimes it had sort of warts all over its skin. Sometimes it was shaped like a hand, like a sort of begging hand that had little insects in it instead of coins. And I realized um, that going around these citrus collections was rather like going around a gallery. And you looked at each tree very carefully and what it had to show you. And the years passed, and I became somebody who knew about Italian gardens. So I used to take lecture tours. I used to take um, groups of people from America and all over Europe to look at gardens. And I would start, of course, to meet the people who were looking after these citrus collections. And while my group was going around, exploring the gardens on their own, I would be talking to these old men. They were always old men, and learning about how you cultivate citrus in gardens around Rome and Venice and Florence predominantly, and all about taking the trees in the winter, and about pruning and about feeding and about propagation. And of course, I then found the greatest collections like the Medici citrus collections, and it became apparent to me that citrus was much more than a plant in Italian culture. It emerged that these collections had been sort of outdoor museums in Renaissance and Baroque gardens. They're extensions of those, what we call collections of curiosities. So that's a very long answer to a very short question.
But you wrote The Land Where Lemons Grow, now a classic. But apart from Goethe, what was your inspiration?
Well, it was part of it, I suppose. At the very beginning, it came from those gardens. And I was fascinated by the way people perceived citrus and the way that it fed into the very early botanical science. You know, people began to understand that citrus trees, you know, they can mutate, and they were trying to understand how that happened. And they were trying to understand why these bizarre citrus fruits occurred, and that fascinated me. So I was inspired by that and by the engravings. Giovanni Battista Ferrari wrote a great book called Hesperides, and then there was Del Pozzo, who did what he called his paper museum, and he had commissioned engravings of all the curiosities, and citrus. There was a whole book dedicated to citrus. So that was my early inspiration. Then, of course, you know, it's sort of leached out from there. Montale writing that wonderful poem about the scent of lemons, and the way that just that that smell that you might encounter just walking down a grimy city street, and you'd get that smell of lemon blossom, and he called it riches. You know, even the poorest people have access to the riches of that. And lemons, I just found, once you start, you know what it's like, once you start looking, lemons come into literature, lemons come into art, wonderful still lives. Lemons come into medicine, of course, from a very early point in the history of medicine in Italy. So I began to realize that a book about citrus could span Italian culture, you know, the politics, the economy, as well as the arts.
Oh, great. But how did citrus fruits came to Italy at all?
How did it come? Well, people always think, Northerners, you see, always think that lemons must be Italian. But there was no citrus. There is no native citrus in Italy, even though it's grown there for thousands of years now. The first citrus to arrive didn't arrive until the 2nd century AD, and it was the citron, that wonderful thing like a gigantic lemon with knobbly skin and very little flesh inside it. It's got pith, you know, that thick. You can make a salad from its pith. And it arrived very specifically with Lubavitcher Jews who settled in Calabria. And they brought it with them because it was essential to celebrating the Festival of Tabernacles, Sukkot. It had to be taken into the temple with them. And so well, it's quite extraordinary, until the 8th century AD, when Arabic settlers came to southern Italy, that was the citrus that was in Italy. And then the Arabs came, and they came from North Africa, and they brought with them lemons and bitter oranges, not sweet oranges. And so you start to get lemons and oranges growing in these beautiful enclosed gardens full of the scent of citrus blossom. And then sweet oranges didn't arrive till the 16th century in China. So it's, you know, they're not at all native.
But can you describe the geographical distribution of citrus fruits and the mutations in the autochthonous varieties? You describe them very well, very fascinating in your book. But there is bergamotto, chinotto.
Yes. Well, I mean, if you to sort of understand that, one has to understand that in the whole world, originally there were just 3 forms of citrus. You know, it's like sort of the beginning of the citrus Bible. You know, there were just 3 forms. It was the citron, which I just mentioned, which came from the Himalayas. There was the pomelo, which is like a grapefruit, really, and it came from China. And then there was the mandarin from, no, pomelo's Malaysia, isn't it? And the mandarin is China. And they begin to move through the world with human migration and trade, really. And the thing about citrus is most plants only cross-pollinate and produce fertile seed with plants in their own species. But the thing about citrus is it's very suggestible. You know, you just put it next to a plant, another citrus plant, and it cross-pollinates. And that's how all the fruits we know today were produced, and it's still going on. So they talk about it being sort of havoc, really. Nobody can really pin citrus down because the family is always developing. But so that's the process. You know, in Italy, what happened when you grow citrus in the same place, in sort of close proximity in the same place for a long time, it adapts to its surroundings, producing species that are peculiar to that place. So as you say, there's a thing the size of a golf ball called a chinotto, and it is a very sort of wonderful and should be inedible, really, shouldn't it? Because it's so incredibly bitter. But because humans always find ways of making things edible, it grows just in Liguria and Savona, really, on the coast of Liguria. So that's northern Italy. Again, that's very surprising. But it's the Riviera, so it has a mild enough climate for the chinotto. And I was saying that we always find ways of eating things that we really shouldn't eat. You know, and sometimes they're really, really laborious. And with chinotto, it's soaked in sugar for, you know, ages and ages and ages. And it's a kind of candied fruit, which is extraordinary to eat because it's the sugar penetrates the skin. So you bite into it and you get this very sweet skin, but it's bitter inside. So it's a sort of really huge kind of taste sensation, you know, bitter and sweet. And they used to keep them, and you know, long before we were around. They used to be in bars, didn't they, in Savona? There would be a jar of them on the counter, and you'd buy an espresso coffee and you'd have one of these in a special little chinotto bowl, and you'd eat one of these and then you'd down your espresso, and it was a sort of a Sunday treat. And then bergamot, of course, is another one, which only grows around the tip of Calabria, so the toe of Italy, on a sort of 30-kilometre stretch of coastline. And again, that's a cross-pollination. And so just by pure citrus brilliance and chance, here is bergamot. Again, a horrible fruit. I mean, they do use it. It's very like incense when you put it in for cooking. But it has pores beneath the skin which hold essential oils, which are used as a fixer in the perfume industry, which makes it the most valuable citrus fruit in the world, and they can't grow anywhere else. It just likes the patch that it's chosen. I love that about citrus. You know, it mutates or it cross-pollinates in a response to certain conditions in the soil and the climate and the temperature, the rainfall, everything about it. It'll produce this thing, and then everybody will want to grow it, and it'll try and grow it in Japan, and they'll try and grow it in North Africa. They can't. It's like the blood oranges that grow on Etna. They only grow there, you know, to that quality, because those are the conditions that those trees have chosen.
You mean La Concadoro in
Concadoro, and also on the east coast, the Etna, the slopes of the volcano, which has a climate which means that the temperature can drop by 10 degrees between day and night, and that ripens the red color in blood oranges, the anthocyanins, and that's what makes them super fruits. That's what makes them full of antioxidants and, you know, all this stuff that's really good for us. Only get it there.
And you're right that eating a Sicilian blood orange or a tarocco is a complex experience. Can you describe it? Extraordinary complex experience.
Well, I think
multi-dimensional flavors.
Yeah, I think it's because in part it's because their sweetness and the bitterness of the fruit are in balance. So unlike a great big Valencia orange, which is just like, it's just really sweet, you have this multi-dimensional taste because you're getting both sweetness and a kind of minerality that is coming from that volcanic soil, a bit like the wines that you get on Etna. You know, they're what we call in wine tasting minerality. It's wet stone, it's acidity, you know, so it's sweet and acid are balanced. And then you've got the anthocyanins, and it's just something that is, I just feel so passionately about it. I mean, it's like a sort of terroir thing. You know, you can't get it anywhere else. I'm just finished writing a book about Mount Etna, so don't get me started on that, you know, on the whole thing of soil. But with citrus everywhere in Italy, you know, it's responding to soil and climate in ways that produce these little industries that couldn't happen anywhere else. And are huge, they're sort of niche markets. And it's a gift, that's the thing. I mean, citrus made places like the Concadoro so rich that the very first, the sort of Proto-Mafia was formed outside Palermo in Sicily in the mid-19th century, entirely due to lemons. You know, the mafia that we have all over the world, mafia behaviors were honed in the lemon groves of Sicily in the mid-19th century. I mean, I only found that out, I remember, towards the end of writing that book. And in a way, it was the most sensational thing of all, that citrus in Italian culture could be taken to be responsible for. And I was really, when I first discovered it, I thought, oh no, you know, that is the sort of thing that I really like to avoid when I'm writing about Italy, because it's one of the cliches. People always say the mafia, ha ha ha, as if it was really funny, you know, when it's the dreariest, ugliest, dullest thing imaginable. It's just crime. But to find that it all started there, you know, was, you couldn't leave it out, really.
Because of the huge profits
Yes, because of the huge profits, because of exporting citrus fruit to America, both citrus fruit and citrus derivatives. And, you know, around the sort of, we've got unification happening, of course, in the 1860s. And so regime change and quite hard, you know, the capitals, you know, were further north, the capital of the new kingdom of Italy, and it was very hard to keep a grip on the whole peninsula. And I mean, I remember there was a British historian who was very famous in the sort of 50s called Eric Hobsbawm, maybe a bit later. He wrote about the mafia and he said it was kind of disenfranchised peasants. Rubbish. It was the aristocracy, you know, and they were getting in. So you would invest all your money on a tiny patch of land in order to grow lemons. And that was very expensive because lemons are such fussy, they're the fussiest citrus of all. They need to have irrigation, good soil. They don't like the wind, so they need a huge wall around them. Probably if you've been able to buy land on the Conca d'Oro, it'll be quite isolated. So you've had to build a road. You've had to build barns and things to store your fruit when you pick it and your machinery. You've probably had to dig a well, you know, and then worse still, it's 7 years before you get any fruit. So all that investment. So you're very, very paranoid. And just as you're finishing off, a sort of really lovely guy will come round and say, God, it's so good to see you. You know, we love having new people around here. You know what? Just don't bother to dig your own well because we've got more water than we know what to do with. So we can supply your water. And if you say yes, you're part of it because he can control your water, cut it off. You know, if you don't pay the pizza, the protection money that will stop people attacking your trees, if you don't appoint somebody that he recommends to be your night watchman, if you don't take the puppy that he's offering you as the guard dog. And these rich landowners, which is what they were originally, controlled everything. They controlled transport from the farms to the docks. They controlled the dockers. They controlled the shipping companies. They, you know, and if you weren't part of it, these very romantic walled citrus groves became a bloodbath. You know, people were shot. Lots of people were shot. So there's that side of the history of citrus as well, which, like so many things about citrus, is just a wonderful lens on a moment in Italian history. You know, it's just a way of an angle of looking at something that people have looked at a lot, and you can just look at it in a slightly different way through that subject. That's what I loved about it, really.
Okay, let's stay now to the talk about the lemon trees again, because you mentioned at the beginning that lemon trees can produce fruits that look very different from each other and sometimes very strange, very odd. Why does this happen?
It happens because, and it can be oranges can do it as well. I mean, because part of a tree can mutate all on its own to produce a fruit which is the result of maybe the cross-pollination of the flowers on that branch. You know, maybe a lemon tree cross-pollinated with a citron, which had already cross-pollinated with an orange. And so you might get a fruit that has a really rugged skin, which is striped yellow and orange. There's also the fact that there's a certain kind of aphid that attacks the flowers of citrus. and that can produce, it attacks the flowers, and that can produce distorted fruit. Particularly the fruit that comes, you know, we call it the Buddha's hand, fingered fruits, that comes through an aphid's work on the flower. And then, because there were collectors, as time went on, people learnt to perpetuate these mutations and these damaged fruits through grafting. So if there's something that comes out really well, you can perpetuate it and it becomes a collector's item. And so there's an awful lot of learning about horticulture that goes on in, and learning about botany and botanical science that went on in these citrus collections through experiment and observation.
Okay, so we'll keep staying on the light side of the citrus fruits in Italy. You were traveling around Italy, all over Italy, in order to meet some very interesting people in the world of citrus fruits. I just named Cristina Di Martino, Miki Borghese. If you want to know some more about this, just buy this wonderful book. But one question is about someone very special, a real citrus enthusiast that you have met. Which one can come to your mind?
Well, I mean, enthusiast and expert would be somebody called Giorgio Gallese, who used to be looking after the citrus collection that the Medici family in Florence began in the 16th century. I think probably the trees that he was looking after dated from the 18th century on the whole. But can you imagine, ever since the 18th century, they had been following exactly the same routine, going into the lemon house in winter, into exactly the same positions. They were all numbered and inventoried. And so each one had its own history that was recorded. And Gallese looked at all the records because there was an artist called Bimbi who did a wonderful painting of all the citrus in the collection in the 17th century. So we know it was a beautiful, great painting, and all the citrus was numbered and recorded in a sort of key below. And he was gradually, through his sort of technical expertise, he was rebuilding this. He was recreating those cross-pollinations to reproduce the collection. The other record, of course, that he had was the wax fruits, which were taken from impressions of the original collection and kept now in the Botanical Museum in Florence. And so that, I mean, for me, that was one of the most exciting things. And seeing those trees, because they'd had this sort of golden existence for hundreds of years, but then the First World War came, and the Limonaya, I think, was turned into a field hospital. And for the first time in their history, those trees were left outside in the winter. Now, you'll know that citrus trees are always grafted onto a different rootstock. So you have a rootstock that is quite resilient and quite hardy, and bitter orange can cope with temperatures down to -7 or something extraordinary, something you really wouldn't expect. And so what had happened to these trees, a lot of them, was that the rootstock survived. What had been grafted onto it died. So the trees sort of reverted to being bitter orange trees, but Gallese had been regrafting them to recreate the collection with. So, I mean, he was a really wonderful person to meet. I think he's probably retired by now. I was meant to go to Spain to do a sort of round table with him, and in the end I couldn't go, so I didn't see him. So I'm not up to date with what's happening. But
Okay.
the people one meets, I mean, I met everybody from industrialists, you know, working with citrus, to people in the fields on tiny farms who really only spoke dialect, and you know, very loath to speak Italian. And so that's the other thing about citrus, is this great span of everything from businessmen and industrialists to people that are actually producing these fruits with skills that they've learnt, you know, that have been passed down from generation to generation.
Thank you for all these wonderful insights. 3 more questions before we conclude. What are you working on at the moment? You just
I'm
mentioned.
working, I've just finished writing a book about the volcano called Mount Etna in Sicily, which, I mean, one of the lovely things about it is that there are elements to do with trees, in this case, pistachio trees, because again, wonderful pistachios grow on Mount Etna, most valuable pistachios in the world, as well as the blood oranges that grow on the Etna plain, and the very special wine. But it's about how do you live on the most active volcano in Europe, one of the most active volcanoes in the world. How do you live there peacefully and successfully, as people have done for 3,000 years?
Oh, very interesting. Yeah. And what would you recommend to those who want to experience the citrus fruits of Italy today?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that people have found with the book is that it actually spans almost all of Italy, from Piemonte in the north, where they have that extraordinary battle where they throw oranges at each other in the streets in the winter each year. Moving down to Liguria, and I mean, it is fascinating, the chinotto, and there's a drink called chinotto which has a very interesting history, and there are bars there that sell it, and there are places that sell the fruit, and you can go to these beautiful orchards and see them growing. And then moving down, if what interests you are the gardens, you know, the great gardens of Italy have citrus collections where you can see exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, go to Florence, or go to Lucca and look at the gardens around Lucca. Go to the gardens around Rome, and then you're moving into, you know, it's only when you get to Naples do you get into citrus country, in the sense that you've got citrus trees growing in the earth and not having to be brought in. Oh, I missed out Lake Garda, of course. Citrus grown by Lake Garda in the shadow of the Alps and having houses built round it. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing, to go and look at those, what remains of that industry. And then just, I mean, something that's lovely about citrus as well is it, you know, it crops lemons crop all year, but oranges are winter fruit, and citrons, and, you know, go and eat blood oranges fresh off the trees, tarocco, go to the market in Catania, and buy yourselves tarocchi and eat them, and you'll think you've never eaten them. Anyway, you eat an orange in Italy, you feel like you've never eaten an orange before, and the scent of it. I mean, when I was researching that book about Italian gardens, we had a flat in Siena that we used to retreat to in between our camping trips with this baby, very messy. You need to go home and wash everything. And I remember coming in, and it was one of those very traditional houses. So you went into a courtyard, and there were various flats and staircases going off this courtyard. And then our flat, you went down some steps and through 2 doors to get to our flat. And I went into the courtyard one day off the street and I smelled orange. When I got down into our flat, my husband had just peeled an orange, and it was just that you know, the idea that that essential oil was so powerful, pinging into the air, you know, just being in Italy in orange season, eating oranges. Can't recommend it enough.
The last question, how
Yeah.
do you make a limoncello?
Well, there's a recipe for making genuine limoncello in the book. And the great thing to remember about genuine limoncello is it isn't bright yellow. So when you're offered that very bright yellow limoncello in a restaurant, you know, to eat, to drink after, in a tourist restaurant, to have after your meal, you'll know that that's an industrial product. What you should be looking for is that sort of dark color. That's the genuine stuff.
Thank you so much for this book. It was, as you see, I enjoyed it very much. This is the cover again.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you for your book and your work and your love for Italy as an Italian.
Well, thank you, Clara, for your appreciation, and it's been lovely to meet you and to talk to you. Thank you so much.